We get a lot of questions about easements of various shapes and sizes, about what to do with land that was agricultural or could be agricultural. And we have been working with American Farmland Trust and trying to help everybody figure some of this stuff out and be a resource and help you get in touch with the people who are really, really resources, which are two of the people on the screen right here and all of the people who work with them. So I am Megan Brenn-White. I'm the head of the Upstate Curious team at Compass. And I welcome everybody here to Agricultural Conservation Easements 101 with Tim Biello. And this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I have been completely convinced by all of the data and stories and information that I have learned through our partnership with American Farmland Trust that agricultural land in New York State is really at risk, that we need to do whatever we can to preserve it. And I know that we as a real estate team, we do around 250 transactions a year. Just to give you a sense of the scope, we work across 12 counties. We're starting to see the first climate migrants, people who are coming from California, from Texas, from Arizona. They're buying land, they're buying homes in our area because we are one of the places that is projected to have a milder climate. To me, that's pretty like a direct line to where are we all getting our food, when things change. So without further ado, I wanted to actually have Karisa Centanni, whose title I'm completely forgetting from American Farmland Trust, if you'd like to give an intro and yeah, if you could say a few words about New York Farmland Access Fund and maybe intro Tim because you know him best, and I'm just gonna scooch myself out of here.
Sure. Thanks, Megan.
Thank
So
you.
I am Karisa Centanni. Great to meet everyone. I am a senior philanthropy officer at AFT, essentially help our members and donors align their values and their philanthropic goals with our work when appropriate. So in that vein, I was able to meet Megan through a non-operating landowners network workshop series, which took place 2 years ago and is still somewhat active. We are figuring out how that workshop series will evolve because there's an extraordinary network up and down the Hudson Valley of non-operating landowners who have really dug into some of the issues that that we're working on and that they're working on with their land and with farmers in some cases that they're bringing onto their land. But we'll hear from one of those non-operating landowners, I believe, in another series that we do, another webinar series that we do with Upstate Curious. But today, in addition to learning about conservation easements, which my colleague Tim will get into in just a sec, that really is a huge part of what the New York Farmland Access Fund aims to do. And that's a fund, if you haven't heard of it yet, as Megan noted, she's put a link in the chat that describes the fund. But I just want to celebrate Upstate Curious for a moment because really without their extraordinary support of a $250,000 gift and then a commitment to help us raise a full $1 million over the course of the next 5 years, we wouldn't be having this conversation today and we wouldn't be closing on our first project in just a few weeks. We have plans to close on our first project in Columbia County in right around April 1st. I was just there. It's so exciting to meet the farmers who are in line to purchase that farm from us. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but in a nutshell, this Farmland Access Fund will do exactly what it sounds like in its title. It will allow American Farmland Trust to purchase farms that are being threatened by development in some cases, put a conservation easement on them if there isn't one. If there is one, we might add additional affordability covenants to help the price go down, so to speak, for farmers to then purchase themselves. We'll hold that land, kind of AFT's role will be multiple, but at the very first, we'll hold the land until farmers can get the financing in line to buy that farm and create a pathway for themselves to permanent land ownership, permanent farmland ownership. That's a really big deal, especially in the Hudson Valley, where some of our farmland costs are the highest across the state, not including Long Island. So, yeah, we are just, so happy to do this. And then, of course, we know once farmers are owners of that land, they might need additional support. That could be through technical assistance, that could be through farm viability, business technical assistance. And our team, we're a team of about 14 people. Actually, I think it's grown to 16 people across New York State. And yeah, we have an amazing team from soil scientists to social scientists who are ready to serve these farmers. And we do a ton of partnering, including with, of course, cooperative extensions. So great to see Haley on the call. And yeah, I think I will pause there. You'll be hearing more about the fund throughout Tim's presentation. And I know we have limited time today, so I'm always happy to answer questions. Folks can get in touch with me.
Karisa, do you want to put your email in the chat also? I think that would be great. All right, I'm going to remove your spotlight, and all we see is Tim now. So Tim, would you introduce yourself and say why you're talking about this topic today?
Sure.
Maybe even how you came to learn so much about agricultural conservation easements.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me. And so my name is Tim Biello. I work with American Farmland Trust in our New York office as a New York Program Specialist. So what that means is I'm working with farmers and farmland owners on projects they are pursuing. So for farmers, that might be a farm seeker who's trying to find land here in New York. Could be expanding an existing business, could be to start up a new business, or to possibly take on an existing business and carry it forward. We work with farmers who are on the other side of that spectrum and who are looking to transition out of farming. So they are trying to figure out what to do, maybe with their land. They want to see it stay in agriculture. Maybe they have somebody in their family to come in the farm succession process. Maybe they will be transitioning it to a farmer from outside of the family. So helping them think through the variety of details that are included in that. We can chat more about any of that as the conversation here moves forward. We also work with what we call non-operating landowners. Those are folks who own farmland but don't farm it themselves. So in those cases, they're often making leases or some type of other tenure arrangement available to a farmer. And for both those senior farmers, those older farmers who are looking to transition, for those non-operating landowners, a really important tool for them is often the conservation easement, in this case, an agricultural conservation easement. So I assume, we'll dive into more about what is that, what does it mean, how do they work, what should you know about them, those types of things. But those are often a tool for both farming and non-operating landowners to ensure that land doesn't get developed, and to ensure that hopefully it also will always remain available to a farmer and for agricultural purposes here in New York. Part of how I got connected to that with the work with American Farmland Trust was through farming. So prior to working with AFT, and still now, I've been farming here in New York. Started farming in New York around 2006. And as of it was around 2015 that got onto a farm property in Saratoga County, which was where I live, and have a farm here, and then also work out of my farm office where I am right now, where I get to do my American Farmland Trust work remotely now. So in addition to working with AFT, I also operate a full year community supported agriculture farm. And as part of my own farmland access transition or journey, a conservation easement was an important tool that we utilized to achieve affordability and to also ensure that for the long term, this property will always be used for farming and will be affordable and available to farmers. So it's something that I both went through on the farming side of it, and then get to work with a lot of other farmers and landowners through my work with American Farmland Trust. So can look at it maybe from a couple of different perspectives.
So let's just start, right from the beginning. I would say is what is a conservation easement? And then maybe what is the difference between an agricultural easement?
So a conservation easement is a legal deed restriction, something that would attach to the property, and it would be used to achieve some type of conservation goal. So perhaps that is trying to restrict development on a property for water quality purposes, for a scenic view, for wildlife habitat, or in this case, for agricultural purposes. So the conservation easement will have a stated purpose in it. And in the case of an agricultural conservation easement, it would be to protect that land specifically so that it will be available and usable for agricultural purposes so that it could be farmed. So you could think if you take a property, and if you're say a private landowner, you have a property, you have a whole suite of rights with what you can do on that property. And one of the things that you could do there is you could sell it for development. There's going to be subject to, say, zoning codes or local land use regulations, but within that context, you have some flexibility in here. So if you look to put a conservation easement on your property, what you're doing is essentially adding an additional layer of restriction that says this property can't be, say, subdivided or have retail lots or other things built on it, because the purpose of this property is now permanently to be available for farming. So it puts essentially a permanent restriction on that land so that it would be not developed and remain available for agricultural purposes.
So I want to also encourage everybody, if you want to, I mean, if you want to ask questions, you can like raise your little Zoom hand or just chat. I mean, just put them in the chat and I can sort of moderate as well. So this is permanent, right? Like is an easement ever reversible?
There are temporary easements. I don't interact with them a lot, so I won't feign that I have a deep knowledge with them. They do exist. They're in most cases what we work with are permanent restrictions. So which is a understandably hard concept to get your head around, that this is forever. And I think for our purposes, when I'm speaking to, say, a landowner who's exploring them, the thing that I think is really important to take home is like it's a big decision to make. We think they're a really important tool for landowners to have access to ensure the legacy of a farm. In some cases, there's farms that have been somebody's family for multiple generations, or for anyone really who comes to connect to their property and starts to really care about it. There's a connection you have to it, and you might want to ensure that some aspect of that carries forward. But they are a big thing to undertake, and you want to make sure you're thinking through the details of it. I would say, can they be modified? The answer is yes. They can be modified, but they're set up to be difficult to be changed. So there are ways to change them. Typically, if you're going to make modifications, there has to be some enhanced easement value that's added to it. If you're gonna make future tweaks, but it is possible, but difficult to change them.
So, and when you put this into place, when this happens, my understanding, you are paid a certain amount of money by some organization, or not necessarily, I guess, right? So you could like donate it. And then also, so I would love for you to talk about that. But the other side is then, because I know this is important for New York Farmland Access Fund, the value of your land intentionally drops because the idea, I mean, it should drop because you no longer have, any development rights there. So my other, I mean, I guess the first question is how does somebody get paid? Who do you work with? The second question, which maybe you could even answer first, is do your taxes go down because do the assessors see the value of the land dropping with this easement, or is that not something they consider?
There are tax implications, and there are a lot of great resources out there. AFT has some, the Land Trust Alliance, LTA, has a number of great resources for landowners to look at. It's when you get ready to pursue an easement project, you're going to be well served to pull together a team of advisors, including tax accountants, CPAs, folks who can look at those type of details with you and look at your specific situation. Where are you at in your life? Where are you at in terms of your income streams? Are you planning to retire? At what time? Et cetera, et cetera. All those things would factor in. And those go out of my depth. I don't work with folks at that level on their projects, but yes, there are implications related to both the actual, depending on how you do the easement, you alluded to it, you could donate an easement, work with a land trust or another qualified organization. So typically either working with the land trust, which is a group that is specifically set up to work with landowners and extinguish those development rights. In some cases, land trusts will actually own properties. In some cases, they will just hold easements on properties that are still owned privately. And I think that's an important thing to real quick note, is that if you're a landowner and you sell a conservation easement on your property or donate it, you still own the property. You still have a lot of discretion about what you can do there, but essentially you've added this additional layer of restriction. You're still a property owner. The land trust would be one of the potential partners you would work with to extinguish that development right, and they would hold that right. They would steward that and ensure that you're sort of following it all future landowners are following it. So what I want to say there is, yes, tax implications. You would pull together a team of advisors and follow that. In terms of the pathway to get there, you're either donating it or you are selling those easement rights. If you're donating it, that's a separate process where you would talk to the land trust. There's a different timeline on that process. Typically, they might be a little bit faster. Typically, there might be a little more flexibility in how some of the details of the easement will be worked out, and how it looks in the end. But of course, that requires that you're in a situation financially and otherwise where you can donate the value of that easement and presumably see some benefit from the donation in terms of charitable deductions, but also in terms of that you aren't requiring to get the compensation for removing that value from your property. The other way that you would do it is to sell the development rights, and that typically would mean going through some type of competitive application, either for state or federal funding, to basically pay you a one-time payment for removing that right to develop the property. There's a value associated with that. Again, at the beginning of this conversation, I mentioned that you have these rights as a property owner. One of them is to develop it. Well, that has value associated with it, and that value is sort of embedded in your property. So if we just took like a round number, you had a property that was worth $500,000. It could be that we just are making up a number. Let's say 50% of that is the ability to sort of develop and put houses on that land. If you were to sell that easement, let's just say again for round numbers, it's $250,000. So now the remaining value, if you've done that, that property is now sort of valued at $250,000. And so that's where some of those tax and other considerations would come in. There is still, though, additional values, which we can dig a little bit more into. I think Karisa mentioned this at the beginning. There are sort of more standard, let's say, agricultural conservation easements, and then there's additional restrictions you can build into them that take them a step further towards trying to ensure they're affordable for farmers. They're not just purchased as, say, estate properties for someone who just wants to have a big, nice, conserved property. They can try to encourage that land to be more affordable and to specifically go into the hands of farmers. And so we can talk more about those whenever feels right. But yeah, there's all sorts of details that come in. So I guess I'll wrap up this section of my response by saying pursuing an easement is something that takes a while, both because it's a really big and important decision to make, and also because there are a lot of details.
Well, that actually was going to ask, we do have a question, but I do want to, I mean, my understanding is this is a years long process, not like 6 months, but like, I know the people who've been through, I mean, it seems like it's like 2 or 3 years to get it. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair and that's accurate. I think if you were 100% ready and you knew you wanted to do an easement and you got in at just the right time, let's say you wanted to go through one of those competitive grant processes for, say, state funding, which would take a little while to get all the stuff ready. I mean, the land trusts, let's say that you're working with, they're taking on a permanent restriction and a responsibility to steward it. So there's a lot of things that they have to do in terms of their due diligence to work with you and assess the property and X, Y, and Z to get ready for that application. Then you need to go through the application, and it's a rolling application now, so it does go a bit faster. But you should expect it to be at minimum from once you're really ready and apply to when it's done, probably a year or more. And that's, I think, on the low end. They have happened faster than that. I think somewhere in the 6-month ballpark last time I looked was how fast it took, but I would say more commonly it's 2 to 3 years. And you can be in a process where it's, especially if you want to keep asking more questions or keep pushing the needle on how exactly the easement's set up and say, we want it to be a little more like this or a little more like this, or you change your mind. It could also draw out for quite a while, or there could be funding hiccups on the funding side of it, or lots of things could happen. But I would ballpark it at least being a few years. And that's once you've really applied. So the lead up to that would also take additional time where you're sussing out what you really want, who else in your family should be involved in that discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Are there farmers involved? Whatever the various team members are getting their input.
We have a very practical question here, which is, how would an agricultural conservation easement affect someone's ability to have horses on their property?
Yeah, that's a good question, an important detail question. That would depend on how the easement is written. So it could be that it has very little to no impact, or if they are restricted, then it could mean that they are prohibited in some way, depending on how the easement is written. It's not that common in most of the areas where I'm working to see that, but I think in some places, again, where maybe some more of this like estate value of land that's protected but still able to be used for different for different purposes. In some cases, I think they have put language in there to try to promote, say, more food-focused agriculture. And so in those cases, I think sometimes easements will restrict equine operations, but it's really going to depend on how the easement is written, because it could have no effect on that.
So that is actually a good lead into another question that I had, which is my understanding that there are kind of moves that I guess, I don't know if it's a state or federal, grant giving folks are making to really make sure that the land is agricultural land that is going to have an agricultural conservation easement on it, and not just like, could be, don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So is that something that you've seen that they want? Do they want like land that's actively in practice, or has there been any change, or am I just
There's a whole set of criteria that, like, again, this is going to depend. Are you donating it? Are you seeking funding for that easement? Is that funding coming from New York State? Is it coming from the federal government? Are you getting separate funding from, say, a foundation or something? So how are you doing it? There are criteria if you're going through, say, the Farmland Protection and Implementation Grants process, the FPIG process here in New York, which would be through the Department of Agriculture and Markets. So if you're going through that, they have some criteria that they want to see that will rank it higher or lower within the process. If it's actively farmed, if it's supporting a farm transition or farm expansion in some way or viability, if it's larger parcels for a long time, and still I think to some extent, though, they've changed, and there's different kind of categories to which you can apply, so that smaller parcels are maybe a bit more competitive in the process. There's been some updates there that I'm still not quite all caught up on, so I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but my understanding is that, for a long time, for essentially the same type of process, there was the sense of like, what we could go through the same amount of work and all this and have 300 or 1,000 acres or something put into an easement versus 30 acres. So typically there would be greater value put towards that larger parcel. But especially as we think about the importance of bringing on new farmers, avoiding over concentration in food or farm ownership in the food system and all these other things, being able to have smaller distributed, owned by different people parcels of farmland has a value. And so finding new ways to modify the tool of that farmland conservation process and the way in which they get funded to allow for those farms to be competitive is something that is happening.
Gosh, okay, I have like 5 competing questions in my mind. But I'll go with one of the ones that I've always wondered about. Is there like should you talk to different land trusts and organizations? Like, is it, or you're just like, I talked to this one and that's fine.
Yeah.
I'll go through the
Yeah,
same.
like a contractor question,
Yeah.
like, should I speak to 5 different contractors and get 5 quotes? I think there is value in that, but I'll step back by saying it's going to depend on who is operating in your area. You may be an area where there are multiple and overlapping land trust work areas. You may be in a space where there's only one land trust. It is possible, but here in New York, we have a great variety of very talented land trusts and land trusts. Not all land trusts do agricultural conservation easements. They may be set in place to do more, say, wildlife or open space type of protection. In New York, there are a lot of land trusts that work within this agricultural protection space, and some of that I should mention. Many of those land trusts are partners in a project that American Farmland Trust coordinates. We talked about the New York Farmland Access Fund, which is a really exciting fund to promote farmland access and transition here in New York. That's sort of happening within the umbrella of the Farmland for New Generation New York program, which is a project of American Farmland Trust getting in partnership with New York State and making a number of resources available to farmers. That includes the New York Farmland Finder website, a place where farmers can like list a property they're looking for or what they're looking to do. A farmland owner can list the kind of property they have and who they hope to meet with. There are a suite of resources on that site. And then there's also, and really most importantly, a whole network of regional navigator organizations who are available on the ground around New York State to do one-on-one work with farmers and farmland owners. And that includes, here's where I'm going to tie this back in, that includes a lot of land trusts throughout the state who have expertise in farmland conservation and can work with you to work through those details, assess the viability of the project, make sure you're asking the right questions and not moving forward unless it's a good idea. And so to the question of how many should you speak to is, it really depends on how many are working in your area. There could be just one. And if that's the case, that's probably who you'd speak to. But you could still contact another land trust to ask them questions. You could contact American Farmland Trust and myself or some of our other colleagues here in the office in New York State would have a conversation with you to help you think about it from the perspective of, we are a land trust, we do hold conservation easements, but in a lot of cases, especially if there's an existing land trust that has that capacity and the familiarity with farmland conservation, then we would defer to them to be the actual easement holder, but we could be a partner in the project in terms of brainstorming with you, asking you questions, helping you think about all the details, making sure you're getting the right referrals and talking to the right people. So we would be a partner in that in addition to whatever your local land trust is. And then it is possible to have an easement with government entities or municipalities. So soil and water conservation districts could hold easements, or your town could hold easements. There are some benefits to having it with a land trust, I think, because that's their like specific mission to do that kind of work, but you can work with other partners.
So I know that we were talking a little bit about this before the Zoom started, and affordable housing writ large is a huge issue also particularly in the Hudson Valley, also in the Catskills, also in the entire country. So there's that. And I guess one of the questions, and especially, I mean, certainly housing for farmers and housing for farm workers in these areas where land is expensive, housing is expensive, have there been any changes to, to sort of say, like, you can't build a house for like anybody, but if it's for the farmer, like, how would that work? Because it feels like it would be counterproductive to say all of the land cannot be used for development if you need housing for a farmer.
Yeah, there's a lot to touch on there. I mean, I think in terms of the farmer housing, no, that is a huge issue. And a lot of my work is really focused on helping farmers with farmland access and transition projects, and easements in many cases are a tool for that. And their access is not just about finding land that, say, they could lease or something like that. They also have to be able to feasibly maintain a viable business, which means they have to be close enough to do so within the context of all the sort of structural challenges that exist for farming in terms of downward pressure on prices and high costs of startup and all these other things. So their ability to find secure and quality housing either on or very close to their farm properties, whether they're leasing, owning, or otherwise, is really critical. So leaving that there for now, the farmer housing thing is a huge deal. How easements interact with it, maybe say a couple of things about it. One is when an easement is constructed and put in place on a property, they're typically going to have sort of multiple zones within the easement. Some of those are going to be more or less restrictive. So I'll describe, for example, like within my easement that we have on our farm property in Saratoga County, we have like 3 zones. There is the least restrictive of those zones, which is our farmstead area. And something like that would generally be included in most easements. That farmstead area is where probably the farm owner's home is. There might be some of their other agricultural structures, and it's some sort of, roughly, it's like a building envelope. It's an area where, subject to zoning, you can do what you need to do within that region. Maybe let's say you have a 100-acre project and you've got like 5 acres that are in your farmstead area. And within that area, you could, if you're allowed to within zoning, you could build a second home, you could build housing for farmers, you could put up those barns, you could do whatever you want. Then you're going to have the most restrictive on our property would be our farm areas. And those are the bigger fields and the open areas wherein the goal of the easement is to keep them as functional for farming purposes as possible, so we can do the least there. And then we have sort of an in-between area that I think in our easements termed a recreation or a rural enterprise area. Within those, we could do a bit more, but not quite as much as the farmstead and not quite as restrictive of the farm area. How that relates to housing is, in a lot of cases, you can build farm worker housing, both within the farmstead areas and within the areas that aren't at that most extreme level of restriction for what you can do there. So we could put farm worker housing, in our case, in those rural enterprise areas that are around the farm areas, but we couldn't build farm worker housing right on the farm area. We could put up a greenhouse. We could do a barn if we needed to. You'd always want to think about how that affects the flow of farming in those areas and what might happen in the future, but you can do it. That can be set up differently in maybe in different easements, but that just gives you a sense of, like, for example, there are different levels of restriction, and farm worker housing would be allowed in some, and it just depends on how you set it up. The other thing I would note to your question, I think this is relevant to anyone considering these projects is like, easements are an evolving tool. So I think
Mhm.
as we look at what has been done with easements in the past, we're going to look at them and say, oh, I would do it this way now that I know how this is all happening, or I would change this part about it, or I wouldn't include this thing, or that is always going to be the case. They are not a perfect tool. So I think that should just be noted. They are a really important tool, given that we are losing so much farmland around the country and here in New York included. They're a really important tool to try to stave that off and to try and ensure that this really vital resource for our own ability to eat, to the ability to live in places that we think are beautiful and nice to be in, to wildlife habitat and groundwater recharge and clean air and all these things, they're critical. So the easement is a tool to help ensure that we don't lose that. They are something that we will need to continue improving over time. And I think how they support farm worker housing and the ability to support farm transitions is one of those areas that could be improved.
So let's say, I mean, I guess this is like in your situation. Let's say there was a farmer who wanted to buy farmland and had it, it had an existing house on it because someone else was living there and working. I assume that they can't, I mean, you can't put that, like, you couldn't say like, this costs $600,000, but I plan to put an easement on it. So you have to buy it first and then put I'm just trying to figure out if there's any like financial benefit at the beginning to doing this.
To having the easement on prior to your purchase?
Well, not, I guess the easement wouldn't be on, but to being like, I'm gonna sort of like use this as part of my down payment. You know what I mean? Like if there's
Yeah.
any way to like actually make it more affordable at the beginning. Cause I mean, I understand if you bought land that had an easement already on it, it would already be cheaper, but like, what if there was land you were looking at that doesn't have an easement on it?
Yeah. Yeah. A really good question. It's a timing question, and it's so critical to how the easement and the conservation of that farmland may or may not be something that facilitates somebody's ability to get on that land affordably. So yeah, there's situations where an easement is already on a property. So if you're looking to own land, you don't farm yourself, but you want to say one day own farmland and make really good, high quality, secure arrangements available for farmers. There might be land that you find that already is an easement. So you're going to want to do some of your own due diligence and say, what does this easement say? What does it allow? What does it not allow? What does it mean? And that would be true if you're a farmer. If you're a farm seeker and you are looking at land and it has an easement on it, you're going to want to make sure you read up on what that means. Just because it's an agricultural conservation easement doesn't necessarily guarantee it will support all of the farm and future goals that you have. So you want to look into it and read the details if you want, and it probably will mean that land is more affordable if it has the easement. That's not a guarantee because there is still the estate value to potentially contend with if it doesn't have additional restrictions as part of it. But it, generally speaking, probably will reduce that purchase price. If you want to use it as like sort of a simultaneous transaction, that can be challenging. It's going to require a landowner who's willing to work with you and be patient through the easement process and have a purchase agreement with you in place that signals it's going to be sort of this simultaneous transaction where they're going to hold the land all the way through the easement process, the years that takes, all the things that will happen in their lives during that, all things that will happen in your lives. It can be done. It sometimes is done. It's hard to get all those things to line up just right so that easement goes through, sale is triggered, lending is all in place or whatever it is, and then you purchase. But it would be at that lower value.
That's what I was thinking. The only way to do it would be to have the seller do it, basically. So
that
it
is
would
what
be
they
that
have
they're
to.
saying, although I guess if somebody really was committed to having somebody continue to farm their land, they could even have theoretically bring the new farmer on as a tenant during that process. So they're already, getting things established and, and already like working the farm and establishing whatever infrastructure. I mean, that could be risky for both sides, but
they're really challenging. We sometimes say it's really hard to get into and it's hard to get out of farming, to do that well and take care of yourself and then, do it under secure conditions for your, whether it's the future of your life there on the farm and how that's all going to go, or it's your future in retirement and thinking about all that you have there. So yeah, it can happen. And you have to line all those things up. The timing of it all has to work out, the level of trust and security, all the arrangements that you need to have in place. It can be done. And there are a lot of land trusts who have worked with farmers on those types of projects. Then there's also the post-sale easement. So if you were able to purchase the land, if you could afford it at that full value, and if you're able to, shoulder the carrying costs of the time between your purchase of it and getting the easement in place, then you could purchase it and hold it, ease it, and use the payment from that easement to pay down on that amount. And there are groups that sometimes do bridge loans, which would be used for that purpose, because it is hard to find that landowner who says, and can provide the level of security and everything else that's needed to say, yeah, I'll work with you for the next 2 to 5 years to get this all teed up. That's hard. So sometimes a farmer can get a bridge loan to buy the land and become the owner, and then go through that easement process. If they can, again, if they can make all the numbers work out as part of their financial evaluation of the project.
That makes sense. That was sort of what I guess that also makes sense. So it's either the landowner or somebody else has to come in and help, basically, kind of.
And that's the idea of this New York Farmland Access Fund, is to be able to support farmers by being that patient landowner who not only is going to try to help with that kind of that timeline misalignment, but also would be trying to provide, as Karisa mentioned, a variety of technical assistance to them in terms of that transition process, the business planning, the lending, lining up the financing, farm viability considerations that are happening along the way, and all the variety of things that come up for farmers. So, and being an organization that is focused on farmers and farmland is suited to do that. Again, you get that individual private landowner. There are a lot of them that could do it and will do it, but by and large, it's a small subset of the total population of landowners that can do that have the appetite for that have the familiarity and desire to support the project from start to finish, in spite of all the challenges that will inevitably come up.
Because they have to go through they have to go through every little bit of the easement process. So they're the ones who need the accountants and the attorney.
Yeah, they're the ones who are allowed to do it. It's their land as it's structured within our legal system. So they're the ones who can make those decisions and who have to.
So, oh gosh, there was just another. Does anybody have any other questions? I'm like, oh, here we go. Look at that. Haley wrote a question. Can you tell us anything about preemptive purchase rights as a part of conservation easements? Yeah,
absolutely. So that's a tool. It's been around for a little while, but it's getting a lot more traction right now. So definitely getting a lot more conversations around it. You're seeing it take hold and be a part of more easements, either being added retroactively or being a part of the easement when they're first put together. So this is one of the tools we've alluded to that can be a part of an easement and is an additional restriction. So the easement will prohibit the development of that land for non-agricultural purposes, as we've talked about. The preemptive purchase right is an additional restriction that says the easement holder, let's say it's a land trust, has the ability to enforce that the land is sold to a farmer and at its agricultural value. So we have on my farm, for example, so again, to be specific, we have a conservation easement that has a PPR, or preemptive purchase right, or in other parts of the country, it's sometimes called an OPAV, option to purchase at agricultural value. So these are this tool that when we go to sell the land long into the future, hopefully, when we're older and have had this great and successful career at farming, we will need to try to find a farmer who's a qualified farmer, and we will need to try to sell our land to them at the agricultural value of that land, looked at in terms of like the sort of the median agricultural value of land in our area. It even puts that kind of restriction on our house. So again, this is dealing with that estate issue where somebody could say, well, that's conserved land and I'm just going to buy it and build an estate on there, and it's still going to be super unaffordable to a farmer. We could, if we ever had the means and desire to do so, build a mansion on our house. It would still be priced when we go to sell it at median home value in our area, to ensure that the property, including the home, is affordable to a farmer, and that we're attempting to sell it to someone who is a quote qualified farmer, often determined by how they file taxes, but there are other ways it could be set up in the easement. So it's described in the easement, the process by which that land should in the future be sold to a farmer and at its farm value.
And that is what is happening also with New York Farmland Access Fund, right? Like that is, it has to be.
Yeah, that is something that we would often be using as part of these projects. As Karisa mentioned, we're just in the midst of closing on our first project, and that is a situation wherein the PPR would be an additive element to an existing easement to further the affordability for the farmers and to ensure that long term, again, it's going to farmers. Because even with easements, and this is really true when you get into places that are pretty extreme like Long Island, but also in the Hudson Valley, there are areas where even eased land or conserved land is still wildly out of range for a farmer to afford on agricultural income.
Well, I did not know that. I mean, I wasn't thinking about that you could just build be like my house is a mansion that is now surrounded by 300 acres with an agricultural easement. And then the person could just say, cool,
yeah,
I'm just going to leave those 300 acres as they are and walk around them.
Yeah. Yeah. And that happens. So we think of that as like the estate value.
Estate.
By and large, protected land, even if it doesn't have an easement around the country, AFT does national surveys. I forget the exact frequency of which those occur, if it's annual or biannual or something like that, of protected land all around the country. Most protected land remains in agriculture, but that could be in a variety of different ways. And not all of it does. This PPR is a way to ensure that not only does it remain in agriculture and increasingly sort of incentivize or encourage that, but it hopefully also means that increasingly farmers are the ones that own that land. Ownership isn't necessarily a requirement to having a good and successful farm business, but it is certainly one element of security in a pretty uncertain agricultural field. When you're trying to make it as a farmer, it gives you that additional level of security, some level of equity, right, in moving forward and thinking about your future plans. So ownership can be and often is a really important part of a lot of farmers' plans. It's not the only means, and lots of farmers do lease land and can do so successfully, but it can be a place of some level of insecurity. So that PPR sort of is trying to ensure that both, you sort of avoid just estate ownership and you encourage farmer ownership.
I mean, that was, I think, going through the non-operating landowner program, that was really, I think that was one of the things for me that was so illuminating, where I was like, people, especially new farmers, have so many risks and so many initial investments, financial and time and otherwise. And theoretically, if they're leasing land, the land could get sold. It could get, somebody could change their mind about it. And I don't know, it almost took my breath away when I was thinking about, if you had invested all this time improving the land and getting everything set up for your particular farming operation. I mean, I just wish farmers could all own their land. I'll just say that. I know that's not practical, but it would be obviously better if more of them did.
Yeah. The security it provides is hard to underestimate. You can have a really good lease arrangement, and there are a few things I think are important to that. Some of the affordability, the term, whether or not the value you're building into that land comes back to you in terms of reduced rent or compensation. There's all sorts of things that can be done to make a lease much better. And a really good option for an early stage farmer or for a farmer who's looking to expand but doesn't need to own additional acreage. There's a lot of ways to do that. But yeah, that ability to own that land, you think about how that feels to a lot of homeowners, the importance of that in our society, the importance of that on an economic level for your family, for all these things. It's a really critical tool for intergenerational wealth accumulation. It's an important tool for some of the rights it gives you. It's an important tool for that peace of mind and having a place that you feel like you're connected to and is a home. And so that's true for a lot of farmers who, in addition to just living there, that's where they earn their income, and that's where they care deeply about that land and they want to improve it. And it's one of the ways to also help put them in a position to do that best.
That was actually a family was another topic that I was thinking of. Does having an easement or even the PPR, does that preclude you from, I mean, I guess the easement wouldn't, but the PPR, would that preclude, is there anything about inheritance rights that this
Great
change?
question.
So if
Yeah.
you had kids who wanted to, I guess if you had kids who either wanted to farm or didn't want to farm, maybe it's both scenarios.
Yeah. Oftentimes they'll include language that's sort of, I don't know what the right term is, grandfathers in, allows direct transition of that farm to a family member without sidestepping that farmer requirement. That's often included in them. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily prohibit that transition. Again, from my perspective and working both as a farmer and with a lot of other farmers on the challenges of getting access to and transitioning their land, like whether if you want to transition it to a non-farming family member, I think have conversations about how to make sure you're doing that in a way that really is going to be supportive of those farmers that you're going to have arrangements with. But you can do it well, but it takes intentionality and it takes maybe more effort.
Because I think that that's, with the intergenerational wealth piece of it, as everything else appreciates, being able to stay on the family farm, again, I mean, unfortunately, either as a farmer or simply as like a person, if you're a school teacher, having a home, even if it would be pretty, I would imagine, pretty important, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
something that's
Yeah. Yeah. And, to tie back to the housing question that you brought up, like how many homes can you have on a property? Again, just in general, there's going to be some zoning requirements around that, restrictions around that. Practically speaking, there might be some considerations about how many homes are you trying to just build within a property. And then I think there's the big picture, sort of the big societal question, or when we think about the value of this farmland and what it brings to us, do we want to be carving up more farmland for more homes, or could we think differently about where we're living and who's on these farm properties to ensure that it's stewarded, productive, does all these really important things I mentioned earlier. In New York alone, AFT did research that looked at from 2001 to 2016, and it was around 253,000 acres, over 250,000 of acres, transitioned out of agriculture or significantly modified. So a chunk of that were highly developed, not to be farmed again. The remaining chunk of that are what we call like lower density residential development. So it was carved up into parcels that could still technically be farmed, and some may be farmed, but the challenges to farmers are greatly enhanced from interactions with neighbors, where the neighbors didn't like the smell of the cows or the animal that got out or the tractor lights that were on, or the customers coming to the property at hours they didn't want. So you get more nuisance complaints. You're spread further out from your fields, takes more work, more effort, more cost to farm them. It's further to get agricultural suppliers and to get feed and other things that you're going to need. So it greatly hinders the ability to run a successful and viable business, and it greatly increases the likelihood that that land will eventually be fully converted to non-agricultural uses by 10 times. So that is a large amount of land that in those 15 years has been relatively lost or hindered for its agricultural purposes. And we only, there are different projections that AFT has put together looking forward to see how either that would continue, get worse, or could be ameliorated. And I think that's going to require that more landowners, whether they're farmers or not, that have farmland, consider the value of that land, both to themselves, but also from this bigger picture perspective to ensure we don't keep losing it.
So that's one of the other questions, and I think this gets back a little bit to like how they qualify land as agricultural land to some extent. I'm in the Rondout Valley in Ulster County, which was a huge dairy farm area. So where I'm sitting here hasn't had anything really agricultural happening since the 60s. It has been a long time. Like even just trying to get the fields to be hay fields would take some, serious investment. So, we just had the last dairy farm in this area, I think, close or get sold. So, which means that I think there's probably a lot of, there's probably a lot of land around here that was used for agricultural purposes that isn't anymore. Is that land still valuable, or is it for agriculture?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, this is a pretty like wide ranging conversation we could have on that topic alone, which is there's commercial production agriculture for income. There's also cultural values to different agricultural practices and access to land, which which are important, and depending on who you are and what your goals are, that land can still be agriculture. I mean, and also agricultural land is suited to different things. So land maybe in some areas where you are, or into the Catskill areas, you're getting hillier. Maybe it's not as deep of a soil. It's maybe more suited to dairy or livestock or other purposes. You can have agroforestry, farming in the woods for different kinds of products. There's forestry uses. There's all sorts of things that can happen on that. And then there's also, say bottomland or really big flat open fields that are good for cultivation or crop production. So yeah, what is agricultural land is actually, it may sound like it could be like, well, when you see it, but actually it's varied, and it really depends on who you are and what you're looking to do with that farm. So it's a bigger question than it might at first seem. And yes, that land in your area is still very valuable for agricultural purposes.
What about apropos, like same kind of question. What about people who are growing in big greenhouses or tunnels or whatever? Like, does that, because that could be put on anything, right?
Yeah. And there's a lot of, I think being strategic about some of those. In some cases, farmers are putting those up. We have some greenhouses or tunnels on our farm. Lots of folks are doing it because it gives you a certain level of control in a very highly variable weather environment. And so it can be a tool for mitigating risks. But it can also be a way to do lots of creative production practices, changing the zone you're in to be able to grow different crops, giving you protection from winds or hail, doing whatever it is. You can also grow in maybe other environments with a level of protection. So you could do urban agriculture within tunnels or on small plots. You could do that kind of growing on a more hilly area if you have enough of a spot to put one in and establish that well, so that maybe it's not generally well suited to, say, crop production, but you could be doing really intensive microgreens or something like that. There's so much you could do within those spaces, and they do allow you different flexibility and could sort of modify what that land is suited to.
It's a whole world. I would like to, since we only have 3 minutes left, I think I would just like to again stress that there are so many resources and people who can help navigate this, literally called, to some extent called the navigators, or any of the Cornell Cooperative Extension. There are so many people who are there to help, that I know that, whose jobs are knowing about this and knowing how to bring together the right resources. So I think that has definitely felt good for me, thinking through some of these things, is knowing that, like, I'm a marketing person and a real estate person. So, like, there's no world where I would know, about all of these different things. And I think maybe that as a final note, also, Karisa, maybe I'll bring you back here. And I don't know if you want to say, like, who should somebody, if there is a question and they're like, I'm just at this early stages, I want to do it, who's the best person for them to talk to?
Yeah, I would be happy to be the point person for now, just because I can certainly direct the right questions to the right people that we have on staff. That might be Tim Biello, Linda Garrett, who's our New York, New Jersey regional director, has 30 years of experience protecting farmland. Previously worked at a different farmland protection land trust. Yeah, but I am happy to be your point person, happy to share more about the New York Farmland Access Fund and the amazing work that Upstate Curious is helping to make possible. Our stories will be coming out soon about some of the impact we're having. So yeah, anyone who's interested, just get in touch and let us know about your interest, or let us know your questions. It's a really exciting time. And yeah, a great partnership that we couldn't be more thankful for.
Well, and I actually also just put my email there. So Megan, MEGAN @upstatecurious.com, because also, if anybody wants to donate or knows somebody who wants to donate to the New York Farmland Access Fund, we do have this very large commitment to raising $750,000. And I know from Karisa that as soon as we hit it, it's just going to raise. The goal is going to be more. We're going to save more land and get more farmers onto the land. Like, we're here for it. That is not a problem. That is exactly what we want to do. But we are, and I'm glad you mentioned this, Karisa, we are going to have a series of these webinars. So if anybody has any particular questions that you'd like us to cover, just drop a line to me and we can absolutely, take that into consideration as we're sort of building these other future webinars and other content that we're going to share. So Tim, I am so grateful for your expertise, and you are truly one of the calmest, most knowledgeable people. And I know with your work at AFT and your work as a farmer, taking a full hour of your time is extremely generous, and, you know, I really appreciate everything you do. So
Thank you. Thank you for the partnership on the Farmland Access Fund and for having me here. I think having more folks be aware of, I think what, making sure they're thinking about how important farming and farmers and farmland are, being aware of different ways to support them. And, we're all at AFT, everybody here is really passionate about this work and wants to work with people wherever they're at. So yeah, I think if you're reaching out to Karisa, and then Chris is helping direct you to folks, and then this network of regional navigators that I mentioned around the state who are ready to work with you on a one-on-one level, is something I want to make sure that everyone knows they can avail themselves of, and we encourage you to do so, and we look forward to hearing from you.
oh yeah, and Haley's saying, Haley, what's your email? Do you want to type that in there? There she is. hg2246@cornell.edu. We are going to be sending out this video to every person who registered, and we will also be posting it on our YouTube channel, and we'll be sending it to everybody in our newsletter. So that is another 18,000 people who are hopefully some of them are gonna click on this and get excited about the prospect of preserving farmland. So thank you everybody for being here, and yeah, we'll see you next quarter.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Megan. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.